Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about what I think are the most iconic wristwatches ever created, and the most iconic designs that have ever been conceived. Now the first wristwatch is the Reverso, and this is a dress watch, of course, but it sort of sits on the gap between dress watches and sports watches, as it was designed in the 1930s for polo players, and is reversible simply because these polo players were coming off the horses and shattering their watch crystals. So as a result, being able to reverse the watch and have a simple metal side was far more practical. Now the most typical design features of the case, apart from that folding mechanism, are the strakes across the top and bottom of the case, which really do differentiate this watch from, for example, a Cartier tank. And equally, those numerals on the dial are extremely typical of this watch in that they have that very simple font, which I personally love. Now the reason why I find these watches so iconic is that since their introduction, no other watch has really been built in the same fashion, and this has really been the only polo player's watch, for example. So it's really filled a niche in the market which no other watch has tried to approach, and so it's kept that design, those design cues, very much typical of this particular piece. So as a result, it's different to anything else on the market. Now the next iconic wristwatch isn't just the one timepiece; it's two designs, both by the same designer, Gerald Genta, who conceived these two watches for Patek and for AP. And they are, of course, the Nautilus and the Royal Oak. Now, these have the classic integrated lugs with that integrated bracelet, and also the non-circular bezel. So, in the case of the Royal Oak, because it's the same shape as the portholes on the Royal Oak battleship, it is octagonal, while that of the Patek is more of a rounded square. Now, of course, one can immediately see the design similarities in between these two watches, that squared-off design and stainless steel case. Now, of course, both companies have made gold versions of these watches, but they were very much watches which were in that first generation of steel luxury watches. So people would pay £15,000, for example, for a steel watch, not a gold one, and that was a really new thing in the market. Now, my personal preference is the Patek Philippe, just because I prefer the design. And I also appreciate the fact that it's water resistant to 120 meters, actually, making it far more versatile and rugged. However, both of these wristwatches really are iconic, and as you can see, their design is, in terms of dial design as well, as extremely similar. In terms of date placement and hands, equally in terms of the markings, they are very similar. Apart from the fact that Patek has the lines across the dial, while the Audemars-Piguet has that sort of cloth finish, which I've never particularly cared for, but is beautifully done. Now this next watch is the Cartier tank, and truly has been an icon since the wars, as it's one of those few square-cased watches, and it really was a pioneer of that genre. Now the typical design cues of this watch are those very straight lines between the lugs and across the side of the case, forming a sort of a square into which the dial is placed, in terms of the way it looks. Now the dial has those typical Cartier Roman numerals, with the minute track around the inside in that rectangle. Now at the bottom it has Swiss made, and of course it has that typical Cartier. And in one of the straight lines of one of the numerals, Cartier is inscribed on the dial, which is really a beautiful touch, and one looks out for on Cartier timepieces. Now, really, in terms of the strap choices, these watches really are worn on leather straps. Leather straps of any type. They can be crocodile skin, they can be ostrich. Ostrich actually looks superb on these, or just simple leather. These watches do look great on any leather strap, but don't work with any sort of bracelet or rubber strap, because they are typical dress watches. Now, the blued hands are also extremely typical of this timepiece, and those hands are also quite short and sit relatively near the middle of the dial. Now, one detail which is typical of this watch is the little jewel inset into the crown, which mirrors the blue colour of the hands beautifully. Now the next watch, which I think is truly iconic, is the Breitling Navitimer. Now this watch was brought out in 1952 to replace the chronomat made by Breitling, and it was designed to be a more advanced timing tool for pilots. So it has that slide rule bezel along with that tricompax chronograph with those pushers, which were also invented by Breitling. Previously, all chronographs started, stopped, and reset using the crown. Now, this watch had a slide rule bezel which enabled the calculation of fuel consumption and other measurements on the fly, which was, of course, invaluable in a time when aircraft had very basic instruments, so it was useful to have such a piece of equipment on the pilot's wrist itself. Now, when this watch came out, the funny thing is this watch had the same movement as the Rolex Daytona of the time, which does show how things have changed in the way of in-house movements. Now, this watch really is iconic because it's done everything really in terms of aviation. It's been into space. It's been used by a number of pilots for a number of air forces. But sadly, the version that went into space was never found because it was sent to Breitling for repairs and was actually replaced rather than repaired. Now, typical features of this watch are the fully polished case, the tricompax chronograph, and the slide rule bezel, which with those knurlings around it to make turning it easier. Now, this watch has remained true to its original form in that it, even these days, it's still entirely polished, so it keeps to that old-fashioned aesthetic, rather than making a more rugged watch, which would be brushed. These days, these watches are available on bracelets and leather straps, but in all the sort of the pilot photographs of pilots wearing these, they're always on leather straps, simply because I think it suits the design of the case better. Especially since a fully polished bracelet, which this watch can come with, is an unbelievable scratch magnet. Now in second position there's the Omega Speedmaster Professional. Now this is of course the moon watch. It's not the first Omega to get into space, that was the 57 design, but this was the sort of reboot design in the 60s, which was worn on the moon missions, the Apollo missions, and still is worn by astronauts, which is quite remarkable really. And it still uses a manually wound movement even these days. And this is a design classic, really. It has those straight hands and that useful loom, as well as being obviously the only watch, one of the first watches rather, because there was a Belova that went to the moon as well, but one of the first to go to the moon. This is of course also the benchmark of chronographs. In that it really is a professional, no-nonsense chronograph, in a way that the Navitimer, for example, is no longer a professional watch in that it's too expensive to be worn by professionals, whereas the Speedmaster still is very much what it was at the beginning, a functional, technical, professional watch, as the name would imply. This is even true when it comes down to the polishing, which is a combination of brushed and polished finishes. Which of course means a rugged and resilient watch, but one that is easily refinished. Equally, this aspect is echoed in the way that the pushers and the crown are protected by the very design of the case. Now this will come as no surprise to anyone, but my final choice for the most iconic wristwatch is the Rolex Submariner. Now the Submariner changed the very face of watches. Now, yes, the 50 Fathoms was the watch which came before it and was the professional dive watch, the first professional dive watch. The Submariner broadened that appeal. Whereas the 50 Fathoms remained very much a watch which was worn only by divers, the Submariner merely became a rugged man's watch, rather than a specific watch to professional diving, as the 50 Fathoms was. Equally, Rolex have been very careful with their design changes over the years, and though the whole thing has become much beefier and bigger over the years, moving from that 100-metre water resistance through to a 300-metre water resistance, and an altogether stronger and more rugged case, they've still kept that design and that elegance the original watch had, and so have kept their market. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and do give me your thoughts as to what the most iconic wristwatches are in the comments down below. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy. Please do like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content on my channel. Thank you very much for watching. Over and out.